It's not about talking to Russian generals and giving them new instructions. It's trying to make the West think, oh, we've made a mistake. The Americans have made a mistake by allowing ATACMS to be used on Russia against Russian targets on Russian territory. It is bluff, I'm afraid. I simply see it as yet another bluff. Putin knows that ultimately he is in a weak position were he to be in a war, God forbid, with NATO, because he knows that Russia would be wiped out.
Ukraine has attacked Russia with American long-range missiles for the first time the day after President Biden authorized their use. President Putin has updated the doctrine to allow the use of nuclear weapons in retaliation for attacks on its territory with Western-supplied weapons. Dmitry Medvedev, a former Russian president, now deputy chair of the country's Security Council, said it means Russia could retaliate with weapons of mass destruction to NATO missiles fired at its territory. On Twitter, he posted, "That means World War III." Well, at the G20 summit in Brazil, Sir Keir Starmer dismissed such threats as irresponsible rhetoric and said they would not deter Britain's support for Ukraine.
We will work with partners across the G20, but one nation stands apart. For the third year running, Putin did not attend this summit. He is the author of his own exile. And on day 1,000 of Russia's illegal war in Ukraine, I say again, end the war, get out of Ukraine. And in this moment, when global challenges are affecting us at home, I take the view more than ever that British leadership matters.
Well, the Prime Minister's given his strongest indication yet that British long-range Storm Shadow missiles could also be used on Russian territory, saying Ukraine must have what it needs to win. But he said he would not go into operational matters that could give a strategic advantage to Moscow. Let's bring in Stephen Dalziel, who's a former senior Russian affairs analyst at the BBC World Service. Good evening to you, Stephen.
Good evening, Carol.
What do you make of what is happening in Russia in response to this attack on its territory using one of those US ATACMS missiles? We've had President Putin changing the nuclear doctrine, the circumstances under which Russia could resort to nuclear weapons, and all kinds of threats from some of the senior people around President Putin.
It's bluff. In a word, it's bluff. Russian nuclear doctrine, and indeed Soviet nuclear doctrine, when we go back to that, which of course I remember as well, has always been about trying to frighten the West, trying to make the West realize that, or think that Russia is tougher than perhaps it is. Back in Soviet times, both sides, the US and the Soviet Union, were supposed to have a no first use option for nuclear weapons. The Soviet option, actually, when you looked into it, meant no first use in case, but unless we think someone is about to attack us, and then, of course, we will use our nuclear weapons. And this supposedly new version of the Russian military doctrine now, nuclear doctrine, really doesn't speak to me of anything particularly unusual.
So are you saying you don't think that President Putin would resort to using any kind of nuclear weapon?
No, I don't. I think there's a new clause that says it's completely mirrors what NATO says. If one member of a military bloc, in other words, they mean NATO, if they were to attack us, then it would be considered as an attack by the entire bloc. Well, that's simply, they've taken NATO's terminology, where one attack on a NATO member is an attack on the whole of NATO, and they've just tried to turn it on its head, pointing back at us. The idea, they've updated it. Yes, a massive aerial attack on Russia wouldn't have to be a nuclear attack. It could be with massive air attack and ballistic missiles and so on. To me, this really doesn't say anything significantly new. There's no reason why we in the West, and it's aimed at us. It's not about talking to Russian generals and giving them new instructions. It's trying to make the West think, oh, we've made a mistake. The Americans have made a mistake by allowing ATACMS to be used on Russia against Russian targets on Russian territory. It is bluff, I'm afraid. I simply see it as yet another bluff. Putin knows that ultimately he is in a weak position were he to be in a war, God forbid, with NATO, because he knows that Russia would be wiped out. Another thing that we seem to always assume that Russia, which is a country where there are often mistakes made, where there's sloppiness in many things, but we seem to think, oh, but its nuclear arsenal will, of course, be far better protected and be in tip-top condition. I don't believe that's the case. I think they're going to have the similar sort of problems that Russian society and the Russian army has elsewhere as well.
And do you think that using these American long-range missiles will make a significant difference to Ukraine's ability to hold back the Russian forces? We've been hearing that they have been making some quite significant gains on the battlefield. Do you think the use of these US missiles and potentially in future the use of British long-range missiles too could make a difference?
My worry is that it's too late. This is something that could have been introduced 2 years ago. Here we are today. We are on the 1,000th day of this war. It's taken an awfully long time, 998 days before this announcement was made that the Americans would be prepared to allow their missiles to be fired into Russia. And it's also a question of how big the arsenal of weapons of ATACMS and also the Storm Shadows that you mentioned that Britain and France have now said they would allow to be fired into Russia, how big that arsenal now is. And my fear is that it's not big enough. Now, whether this is President Biden saying, look, I've got until the 20th of January as president, then President Trump takes over, and I'm going to do everything I can, including sending more ATACMS and more other forms of missile and of weaponry to Ukraine. Now, in that case, it might make a difference. But as I understand it, the size of the arsenal they have at the moment might hold back the Russian and North Korean, let's not forget North Korean troops fighting now with Russians in the Kursk region to try and drive out the Ukrainians. But other than that, I can't see at this stage this being a significant factor actually to change the whole course of the war.
Stephen Dalziel, former senior Russian affairs analyst at the BBC World Service. Really good to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.